Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 42 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and relevant information that pilots can use. Coming up in the news, the NTSB has just released the preliminary report on the A5 crash that killed Major League Baseball pitcher Roy Halladay, and we'll share the key findings in that report. And a Cessna Caravan hits a car on takeoff, then crashes in the water. Fortunately, everyone survives, and we'll tell you how it all happened. And finally, a popular high-performance aircraft is getting a new option just in time for Christmas, and it's a parachute. We'll tell you more in a moment. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot, and hopefully we'll all have some fun in the process. Along the way, I'll share my over 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and also a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20 and SR22. Now, last week in episode 41, I talked about the Icon A5 aircraft, its features and limitations, and how Icon seems to be encouraging low-level maneuvering with banks up to 60 degrees just a few hundred feet above the water, and maybe normalizing this with buzzwords like low alt and soft deck. If you want to learn more about the Icon A5, check out that episode. This week, we have lots to share with you, and it all begins now. The NTSB has released their preliminary report on the Roy Halladay accident. We'll include a link to it here in the show notes. I'm going to read from the report. In part, it says, on November 7th, 2017, about 12:04 p.m. Eastern, an amphibious light sport Icon aircraft A5, November 922BA, impacted open water in the Gulf of Mexico while maneuvering at low level near Newport Richey, Florida. Private pilot sustained fatal injuries, and the airplane was substantially damaged. The local area flight departed from a lake near the pilot's home in Odessa, Florida, about 11:47 a.m., which means the aircraft was in the air a total of about 17 minutes. A report goes on, the airplane was equipped with a digital data module that recorded basic GPS, engine, and flight parameters. The airplane was also equipped with a Rockwell Collins engine control unit that recorded engine parameters. The data tracked from the accident flight showed that the airplane departed from a private lakeside home north of Lake Keystone in Odessa about 11:47 and climbed to a GPS altitude of 1,909 feet and tracked north for 4 miles before turning to the west along the coastline. The airplane then flew for 10 miles and crossed over U.S. Highway 19, about 600 feet GPS altitude, and then descended to 36 feet over the water before turning south. The airplane then flew on southerly track past Green Key Beach at 11 feet GPS altitude and 92 knots. The airplane then performed a right 360 turn while climbing to about 100 feet. The airplane continued on a southerly track, flying as close as 75 feet to the Gulf Harbor South Beach houses. The last data point recovered indicated the airplane at an altitude of 200 feet, a speed of 87 knots, on a ground track of 196 degrees. Video footage taken of the airplane before the accident shows the airplane in a descending left 45-degree bank turn and then maneuvering about 10 feet above the water. A witness to the accident stated during an interview with the NTSB investigator that he saw the airplane perform a climb to between 300 and 500 feet on a southerly heading and then turn and descend on an easterly heading about a 45-degree nose-down attitude. He then saw the airplane impact the water and nose over. The plane came to a rest in 4.5 feet in salt water, oriented south, with the fuselage and wings inverted. The front fuselage and cockpit were highly fragmented. The empennage section separated from the airframe and came to rest forward of the wings in an inverted position. 2 inflated life vests and numerous fragments were recovered within a 300-foot radius from the wreckage. All the flight controls and major components were located at the main wreckage site. The cap ballistic parachute system was not deployed, and the handle pin was installed. Now, I went and looked at the Icon A5 POH, and step number 11, the pre-flight says the cap safety pin should be removed and stowed. So unfortunately, the pilot was flying this aircraft in a way that he was not able to use the cap parachute, even if he tried to operate it. Goes on to say that the pilot's logbook indicated he'd logged a total of 703 flight hours, of which 51 hours were in an Icon A5 airplane and 14.5 hours were in the accident airplane. It says that the pilot accepted delivery of the airplane on October 10th, which would have been about 4 weeks before the accident. And that's what the report says, and I think it sounds pretty similar to what we talked about last week. It sounds like Roy Halladay was unfortunately doing a lot of maneuvering very close to the water, and that might possibly have been the cause of this accident, though I wouldn't expect to see a final report from the NTSB for about a year. In happier news, this email comes from the EAA. It says amateur-built aircraft accidents dropped to historic lows. Fatal accidents in experimental category aircraft, particularly amateur-built aircraft, continued their decline during the FAA's 27 fiscal year to historic lows. For the 12-month period ending September 30th, fatal accident totals were down 18% to just 27 accidents compared to 33 accidents in 2016. That continues a 4-year trend that has seen a drop of 47% in total in fatal accidents, despite an increasing amount of flight hours each year over that period. The specific totals compare to 40 amateur-built fatal accidents during the 2015 year and 51 in the 2014 fiscal year. They say in addition, fatal accident totals for experimental category overall, including racing aircraft and those used for exhibit-only research and development and some types of light sport aircraft, dropped as well. Total fatals fell from 49 to 45 during the 12-month period, and they say the final figures are nearly 25% below the FAA's not-to-exceed goal of 59 fatal accidents for the period. Sean Elliott, the Vice President of Advocacy and Safety for EAA, says these are historic lows for fatal accidents in amateur-built aircraft, and this continuing trend is a credit to everyone who is focusing on safety. And it goes on to say that EAA has worked closely with FAA and NTSB on recommendations to reduce fatal accidents, including participating in the FAA's General Aviation Joint Steering Committee that EAA co-chairs. They also mentioned that the EAA focus has included the new Founders Innovation Prize that we've talked about here. That's a competition that seeks innovation to reduce loss of control accidents in amateur-built aircraft, a focus on transition and recurrent training, and use of an additional safety pilot during initial flight testing in amateur-built aircraft. And yes, I would say that 3-4 years ago, there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that experimental aircraft were crashing at rates much greater than those of factory-built aircraft, and there's been a lot of focus over that time on how to get better training and better flight testing so that people don't end up in these kinds of accidents. So kudos to EAA and everybody involved in home-built aircraft. From AOPA comes word that the FAA has a new aeronautical chart user's guide. Now, folks may remember in the past that this was a published document which talked about all the different features you find on sectional charts. Well, this says the newly published chart user's guide is intended to be a live document with updates made as often as specifications are altered on the charts. Valerie Watson, an FAA Aeronautical Information Specialist, says when a new symbol appears on an FAA chart, it will be included in the chart user's guide for the same effective date cycle. Now, what I really like is they have a feature called What's New, and it gives you a quick read that explains the latest symbols and other modifications. And let's talk about some of those new symbols for VFR charts. They include a magenta rocket indicating a spaceport. Also, they have thin blue circles that depict permanent temporary flight restrictions. How's that for an oxymoron? A permanent temporary flight restriction. Anyway, these are now found around California's Disneyland and Florida's Disney World. And magenta diamonds signifying sporting event TFRs, and we have one of those just north of San Jose, California for the Levi Stadium. Additionally, a snowflake has come into the terminal instrument chart procedures to note cold weather restricted airports, and in route charts now feature outlined flags to signify minimum turning altitudes and squares to indicate standalone distance measuring equipment and more. Now, I have posted a link to this FAA document, Aeronautical Chart User's Guide. If you want to learn about everything there is to know about sectional charts, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, then click on posts and you'll find it listed there. For instrument pilots, comes the story from Flying Magazine. The FAA warns of unauthorized use of special instrument procedures. The article says there are roughly 40 U.S. airports that demand more than just an instrument rating and a chart to use them, and the FAA wants pilots to be sure they understand what makes these places special. And they've offered details about this in their recently published Info for Operators 17015. Essentially, these special instrument procedures demand specific crew training and often special equipment on board the aircraft. Now, while these procedures might look similar to a standard approach plate and may actually be included in the electronic database aboard many aircraft, the document says flight crews, quote, must not request nor accept an ATC clearance for special instrument procedures without specific FAA flight standards authorization. The implications in this are that the ATC may have in the past sometimes offered one or more of these procedures in error, and the article lists some of the airports that require a special authorization. Those would include Aspen and Rifle, Colorado, Saranac Lake, New York, and the Lebanon Regional Airport in New Hampshire. We'll have a link in the show notes where you can find a list of all these airports. And in international news from Flyer Magazine, ICOM launches scrappage scheme for old radios. Love that word, scrappage. And for aviators who happen to live in either Britain or Ireland, here's an opportunity to get some cash back when you buy. Let's see, between now and the end of January 2018, either of two models of ICOM portable VHF transceivers or a airband panel mount transceiver, the IC-A220T. In the former case, you get a 50-pound rebate. In the latter case, for the panel mount transceiver, a 75-pound rebate. And they say all you have to do is purchase these models from an authorized ICOM Aviation dealer in the UK, Republic of Ireland, and Isle of Man and Channel Islands. And not only that, you don't even have to turn in a old ICOM radio. You can turn in any radio, and they say it doesn't even have to work. But if you do turn in an ICOM radio, you can keep the battery. And they're doing this to help encourage the transition to the 8.33 kilohertz radios that are now going to be used there. And we have two stories about Lancair. That's the company which builds kit aircraft that are very high performance and extremely popular with folks who are looking for fast home-built aircraft. They say that owners of the Mako, M-A-K-O, which is a composite four-place single, can now equip it with a ballistic parachute using technology similar to that used by Cirrus aircraft. This is a whole aircraft parachute that can be installed on newly constructed aircraft, or it can be added to aircraft that are already in production. They say this option uses the exact same methodology as the safety system installed in the Cirrus SR20, and that the Mako's dimensions are so similar to the Cirrus that they did not need to perform in-flight testing of it. Sean Fiedler, their director of sales, said that the Mako is equal to or stronger than the Cirrus, and it's about 150 pounds lighter. That similarity makes sense to customers, and they are comfortable with the track record and concept of a whole aircraft parachute. It's proven engineering, and we're fortunate Cirrus has paved the way for that technology. Yes, I totally agree. I have flown with customers who have pulled parachutes before, and they are definitely believers in the parachute. Now, if you're interested in the Mako, it cruises at about 200 knots. It can climb at 2,000 feet per minute, and it has an interior about 46 inches across and 48 inches tall. The kit sells for a retail price of $127,000, and a finished aircraft is going to cost somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000, depending upon builder preferences. And they give an example that a fully optioned aircraft with de-icing, turbocharged engine, and digital panel will be somewhat north of $500,000. Now, the other story says that Lancair's Builder Assistance Center is now opening up. This is located in Uvalde, Texas, which is just west of San Antonio, Texas. They say it's a 10,000 square foot climate-controlled hangar, and it's a dedicated work environment for Lancair kit owners to complete either critical subassemblies or the entire aircraft. Now, this is available for both the Mako and for legacy aircraft. And company officials say many owners have reported that the hands-on experience of the build process is immensely rewarding. One buyer builder remarked that it was much more fun than any vacation, and every bit as satisfying in its own way as actually flying the airplane. I think that's probably true. Anyway, they say they have a basic 2-week program as well as a full in-house flyaway aircraft completion program, and that's all from Lancair. And finally, from AvWeb, a caravan hits a car on takeoff. A Tropic Air Cessna Caravan carrying the acting Prime Minister of Belize, a Patrick Faber, as well as the Agricultural Minister and 5 other passengers, clipped a car on takeoff from the Palencia Municipal Airport and ended up in the water at the end of the runway. No one was hurt in the incident, which has sparked an investigation into the safety of the airport. Now, there's a public road that runs perpendicular to the end of the runway, and there are barriers that are supposed to block that threshold when the strip is in use. But some witnesses who were interviewed by local media said that at least one of the barriers was raised at the time of the mishap, and government officials say in a release that the barrier was down, but the car got around it. However, the car ended up there. The caravan's left main gear hit the passenger door of the Subaru, and it slowed the aircraft to the point where the pilot opted to put it into the water, according to a statement from the airlines. The airline said it was working with authorities to determine what measures need to be implemented to prevent another such occurrence. And when I initially saw this, Tropic Air, I thought it was the same company that's Tropic Ocean Air, which is based out of Fort Lauderdale. A friend of mine flies Caravans, Cessna 208s on floats for them. And anyway, it's the same type of aircraft, similar sounding name, but a different company. And we're happy that everybody was able to get out of the accident, even though they got pretty wet in the process. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, results of our listener survey of portable ADSB receivers and what people like and dislike about the different models. Plus, listener questions. A student pilot in Mississippi asked, what his priority should be in learning to fly? Stick around because we'll be right back with answers to those questions and more right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Welcome back. Hey, before we get to the results of the ADSB survey, let me give you a few quick updates. First, for listeners here in the United States, let me wish you a happy Thanksgiving. I really hope you're able to enjoy some time off from work and maybe you're spending part of the holiday weekend with family and friends. One of our daughters is visiting here with her boyfriend this weekend, so we're having a fun day. And one thing they're doing is playing with our new kittens. So I didn't tell you, but about a month ago, we lost our favorite animal of all time. She was a 17-year-old Maine Coon cat named Smudge, and she was just the sweetest, kindest, gentlest animal I think I ever knew. Anyway, we were heartbroken, but after a lot of searching, we picked up these 2 little guys a few days ago, and we're having a wonderful time with these 2 new kittens. And a quick shout out to one of our Patreon sponsors, Michael. He was in visiting from Ames, Iowa earlier this week. He has family here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he is a student pilot. He has about 40 hours of experience, and he wanted to fly with me just to get an appraisal of how well he's doing. And we flew in a Cessna 172, an older round gauge aircraft, and he did great. So I think with a little brush up, he's going to be all ready for his check ride very, very soon. So Michael, thanks for stopping by here at the Palo Alto Airport and flying with me this week. And while we're talking about people who support the show through Patreon, people like Michael, let me mention our newest Patreon supporter, and that's Trevor Moody. Trevor, thanks so much for signing up to send a donation this way every month. And speaking of the Patreon page, I have listed a number of news stories here over the past week. One is the NTSB preliminary report on the Roy Halladay Icon A5 accident. Another is a link to the FAA Aeronautical Chart Users Guide that we talked about during the news. And finally, I've just posted a link to an article that I wrote for Avemco, that's the aviation insurance company, and it's called Hot Props and Proper Magneto Checks. And it's a really good review of all the topics that we talked about way back in episode 13 when I talked about safety around hot props and magneto. So you'll find it a good review of those safety tips. Now, you can get to the Patreon page directly from some smartphone apps that have links in them. Just tap on the artwork on the app. You'll see the show notes, and in there is a link to the Patreon page. Or the easy way to get to it is just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on support the show, or just type in aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, because you folks are all awesome listeners. The articles I've mentioned I've posted, they're free. Anybody can see those. While you're there, check out the goals that I have and consider making a contribution to the show with a donation by your credit card. We have different contribution levels, and you get different little goodies for different levels. So, for example, the $4 a month level, supporters can get access to the original scripts for each of the shows, like this one. And at $8 a month and above, donors can see the news stories that I've cut because I didn't have time for them during the show. And this week we ended up cutting 6 news stories. I always hang on to them thinking I might use them if we have a slow week the following week, but you know what? There's always more news every week, so I've never actually gone back and used any of these cut stories. So once again, you'll find it at the Patreon page. Go on and take a look if you haven't been there, aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now stick around because in 7 seconds, we'll be back with the results of our survey on portable ADS-B receivers. Welcome back. Hey, first, thanks to everyone who has ever taken any of our surveys. I should mention that only podcast listeners find out about the survey because I don't post links to them anywhere online. I don't send out any emails. Only people who have heard about it on the podcast will know where the link is to our surveys. And every month we run a survey at aviationnewstalk.com/survey. The first question on this survey was, are you aware of the limitations of portable ADS-B receivers we discussed in episode 10? 92% said yes, nobody said no, and 8% said, I'm not sure. Now, we talked about those limitations in detail back in episode 10, and wow, it really just seems like yesterday we were talking about it. Now, there's a catch. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. You will only receive this NTSB information, that is the information sent to you from the ground, if you are equipped with ADS-B out. The FAA wants to encourage pilots to equip their airplanes with ADS-B out, so they're requiring this equipment in order to receive traffic information. Their hope is that this incentive gets more airplanes flying with ADS-B out sooner. Many pilots think this is a bad idea. Yeah, I'm one of those. But regardless, it's the way the system works right now. All is not lost. If you do not have ADS-B out, but you are flying near another airplane that is transmitting ADS-B out, you can be a parasite. That is, you can listen in on that airplane's traffic message and display nearby airplanes for that aircraft on your iPad. That's because each ADS-B out airplane receives back an ADS-B in traffic package from the ground station, and it's specifically tailored to their location. In particular, that ADS-B out airplane will see all traffic within a 15-mile radius and plus and minus 3,500 feet of their altitude. And that's being described as a hockey puck. So if you're flying in that hockey puck close to a participating airplane that has ADS-B out, you will have traffic uplink from the ground in addition to the air-to-air traffic. This is the best case scenario, as you'll have free traffic that rivals a $15,000 active traffic system. But as you can imagine, staying within 15 miles and 3,500 feet of an ADS-B out airplane can be a serious limitation. When you're outside their hockey puck, you will only see air-to-air traffic, which is fairly limited. And they summarize it by saying, here's the one thing that is easy to remember. If you do not have ADS-B out installed in your aircraft, you will not get reliable traffic on your iPad. That doesn't mean it's worthless, just incomplete. Most often you'll see lots of air-to-air ADS-B traffic, which is usually airline and cargo jets. But for aircraft that don't have ADS-B out and are using a portable ADS-B receiver, this traffic feature is most useful in terminal areas such as Class B and Class C airports where airliners are coming into land. There you'll see a lot of air-to-air ADS-B traffic regardless of what ground stations are around. This is handy if you're flying into a major airport, but GA traffic is very limited with ASB right now, so you won't see much at the country airport. Yeah, it really does just seem like yesterday we were talking about that. So hopefully everyone is now clear on the limitations of portable ADS-B receivers. You don't see all the traffic. Question number 2, are you a pilot or planning to become a pilot? No surprise, 91% yes, they're a pilot, 9% student pilot. 3, how many total flying hours do you have? About 11% have under 100 hours, so that's probably mostly our student pilots. 23% have between 100 and 250 hours. 13% have between 250 and 500 hours, and 18% 500 to 1,000 hours, and the remaining 35% have more than 1,000 hours of flight experience. How many years have you been a certificated pilot? Less than 3 years, about 23%. 3 to 10 years, another 18%. 11 to 20 years, 22%. 21 to 30 years, 19%. 31 to 40 years, 12%. And then pilots like me, more than 40 hours of flying experience, about 5%. Next question, do you currently use a portable ADS-B receiver when you fly or just to watch airplanes from home? 80% said yes, which is good. That's what the survey is about. 20% said no, though some of them later indicated they're planning to buy ADS-B receivers. Next, we ask, which portable ADS-B receiver model are you using? And the top two choices were tied. Now, one of those didn't surprise me. One of them did. So the Stratus 1S and 2S by Apero, which is the system that's used by ForeFlight most often, 39% of the respondents are using a Stratus. Now, that didn't surprise me at all. But 39% of people are using a Stratux. Now, that ends in UX, and that's a home-built receiver, which is based on the Stratux platform. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Garmin GDL 39 or 39D, 10% of the people are using that. The UAvionics Scout, which is just introduced a few months ago, 8% people are already using that. And Raspberry Pi with a SDR radio, that's a software-defined radio, 2%, and so that's essentially a home-built solution as well. And 2% using the dual XGPS 170 or 190. When we ask people how satisfied they are, well, 5 out of 6 stars. So 35% are extremely satisfied, 39% very satisfied, 22% somewhat satisfied, and only 4% fall below the line and say that there are somewhat dissatisfied. Nobody who is very dissatisfied or extremely dissatisfied. So overall, people are pretty happy with these. The next question was, are you consider buying a new ADS-B receiver in the next 12 months? No surprise here. 77% said no, 23% said yes. We then asked, do you fly primarily in congested airspace where there are lots of planes or in rural areas? And this didn't surprise me too much. Only 13% of respondents said they're flying in mostly rural areas. 47% said mostly congested areas, and 40% said about evenly split between congested and rural areas. And I would expect that the ADS-B receiver is going to be of most value to folks who are not in rural areas, so that kind of matches up with the results here. Where do you live? 93% of respondents came from the U.S., 5% from Australia, 2% from New Zealand. Now, this is going to be tilted a little bit toward where ADS-B is available in the world. Typically, about 78% of our listeners are here in the U.S., so much higher percentage on this particular survey just because we're talking about a technology that you can't use everywhere around the world. Okay, now here's the fun part. I asked, what, if anything, do you like most about this ADS-B receiver? And then later ask about what people liked least. And we'll start first with the Stratus, which was one of our most popular ones. And where people mention their name, I'll mention that as well. So what people liked, this one says, when combined with ForeFlight, synthetic vision as a situational awareness tool and backup, cabin altitude alerting when flying west of the Mississippi, accuracy and ease of use when flying CAP missions for search patterns. And Kyle M. says he likes that it's portable, can take it from craft to craft, and I also loan it out to a friend of mine who is a student pilot, and his trainer doesn't have traffic or weather, so I appreciate feeling like I've helped him be marginally more safe when he's flying solo. Chris A. says that he likes the weather information in AHARS, and this one says predictive lines where the targets will be in a minute. Yes, that is kind of nice to see exactly where the target is headed. This one says, never any complaints. It's a great form factor. I keep it in the center console of the 2005 SR20 we fly. It powers up automatically when aircraft power is applied. It's basically a zero maintenance device. And Fred C. says he likes the callouts for traffic. Someone else says ease of use. Travis C. says it's extremely easy to use, just push the power button, and very reliable. Having the built-in backup AHARS makes for good peace of mind. Having a long-lasting internal battery means I can bring it with me when flying any aircraft and just throw it on the dash or in the back seat without much trouble. And I just realized I should mention what an AHARS is, the Attitude Heading Reference System. Essentially, that's an electronic device which will, when given power, tell you the orientation it's in. So it'll tell you whether it's tilted left or right, pitched up, and so on. And that's often used in combination with synthetic vision to give pilots a view, essentially what it would be looking like out the window. Going back to these comments on the Stratus, someone says a high level of integration with ForeFlight is what they like. Someone says complete backup for the ADS-B in portion of my installed ADS-B transponder, so they're getting it two ways. Someone says just works with ForeFlight, minimal setup and hassles. Another person says easy to use. This person says the weather product reception seems very good, better than the in-panel mount ADS-B receiver. That's interesting. Someone says gives me better situation awareness of airplanes and a backup AHRS. I bought the Stratus after having a vacuum pump failure. Yeah, now that could be dangerous if you lost a vacuum pump while you're in the clouds, because your instruments, your gyro instruments, would slowly start to tilt away in the wrong direction. Someone likes what they describe as a rock-solid connection. I guess that means it works well. Another person says, I love the portability and battery life along with all the natural benefits of ADS-B traffic. At this point in my student pilot career, free weather doesn't help me. Well, hopefully it will someday. Someone likes the FIS-B, which would be the weather. It has its own power supply, so I guess they're talking about the built-in battery. And those are all the positive comments on Stratus. Looking at the negative ones, what, if anything, do you like least about this ADS-B receiver? Regarding Stratus, they say, this person, nothing. I think the price is worth it considering the amount of situational awareness you gain. Kyle M. says he has a Stratus 1, and he doesn't like the size and the black color. Makes it get hot when mounted in the window. I think the newer ones are white, so that probably solved one of those problems. Chris A. says the cost. Someone else says, I'd like to have a single unit that I could also subscribe to XM Weather on. And I know there are some portable devices you can subscribe to XM Weather on, but I don't know that any are combined with an ADS-B receiver. Fred C. says, sometimes it will ghost my own aircraft, causing a fallout when no traffic is there. Yeah, it's not fun to see false targets. Someone else says size. Yeah, it is a little bulky. It says battery life is good, but not great. I routinely fly several flights in a day, and it is done by about 5 to 6 hours of use. Travis C. says the main disadvantage with the Stratus is its incompatibility with applications other than ForeFlight. That's not a huge deal since I'm primarily using ForeFlight, but being able to switch to something like Xavion, Xavion, in an emergency would be nice. Someone else says it's limited to ForeFlight, so app choices are minimal. And another user says seems very sensitive to charging voltage or amps, sometimes refuses to charge with a supplied charger. Someone else says not everyone is ADS-B out yet. Well, that's going to be a disadvantage with all of these receivers. Someone else says it's expensive. Yes, it probably is one of the more expensive ADS-B receivers. And now let's talk about Stratux, S-T-R-A-T-U-X. And I was really surprised that we have so many home builders listening to the show, because this is going to take some effort to put together on your own. And let's see, what do you like most about this ADS-B receiver, the Stratux? Matt M. says, cost, features, cool to build, and make a few Linux tweaks. In several instances, I have picked up traffic on the iPad before seeing it visually. Once it was traffic below and behind me overtaking and climbing, so neither of us could see each other. Another person says, my home airport has lots of university traffic and all of their planes are equipped with ADS-B. Great tool to visualize where the traffic is when entering the area. Another person says, price, ease of use, able to get 1090 when just sitting at home. So I guess it's fun to watch the airplanes from home. Jim P. says, the price. Parts were less than $200 on Amazon. Building it was also a fun project to do with our 17-year-old son who enjoys working with computers. Brian T. says, great GPS, connects easily with my ForeFlight. Interesting to see other traffic. Glenn N. says, it's very feature-rich and available at a cost that's substantially less than commercial options. David I. says, low cost and the satisfaction of using something I built. It works with all the major flight apps. I use it with Flight Plan. That's FLT Plan. Someone else says it picks up so much traffic I never would have seen before. Even helps when you're getting flight following, gives you direction and speed and type of aircraft. Also, it's a GPS for the iPad. Someone else says it's cheap to build. Fernando says everything the same as the more expensive models. Someone else says cheap. Dan M. says cheap. Matthew C. says very cost effective. I think you're getting the picture here. Brian C. says enables identification of planes nearby. Someone else says a less expensive way to understand how ADS-B works and see it firsthand. I like building stuff. Someone else says weather. And finally, a comment is simple and reliable operation. Now let's take a look and see what people like least about the Stratux UX home-built ADS-B receiver. Matt M. says, size, clunky case. I've been unable to determine my own transponder ID to exclude it, so it always shows a traffic alert for my own plane. Having to carry it around. Someone else says, not being a self-contained unit like the Stratus, you have to be very careful of antennas. It's not compatible with the Garmin Pilot app. This appears to be a limitation implemented by Garmin, not Stratux. I don't trust that the traffic shown is all the traffic, and I hear too many pilots relying only on ADSB for traffic and not scanning enough. Yeah, I think there's a common problem we just talked about. It doesn't show all the traffic, but a lot of people think it does. Someone else says, would like a better option to power the unit so it's more compact and doesn't require an external battery with extra cables. Another person says, I had a lot of reliability issues and went through many components. Only after I replaced all the components and the radio dongles twice did I end up with a reliable unit. And this person says, uses battery. Thanks to your podcast, I learned to turn down the brightness on my iPad to increase battery life. He says, make sure the iPad is 100% charged, and even better, carry a spare battery pack. I got caught coming into San Jose International and the iPad died just 10 minutes out. Another person says, size, no built-in battery. Fernando says, basically, you're your own tech support and need to keep up with versions and bug fixes. Another person says, not always reliable. Dan M. says, kludgy. Matt C., accuracy is sometimes lacking with ForeFlight. Brian C., I have not built a very good case for it. Another person says, it's homemade and not supported by dedicated staff, so obviously not suited for mission-critical use. And two people said, nothing really, so they don't have any complaints about the Stratix home-built approach to ADSB receivers. Now let's talk about the Garmin GDL39 or 393D. And James R. says that what he likes most about it is that it's compact and has a great battery. Rusty G. says the ability to show radar, albeit delayed, the ability to receive the weather information, METARs, and TAF at other airports in flight. Alan B. says reliable traffic and weather feed out to my panel-mounted Era 500, which is a Garmin portable GPS. Someone else says easy to use with Garmin Pilot. And Dave R. says, I like that I can now use it with ForeFlight with a smiley face. When asked what people like least about the Garmin GDL39 or GDL39 3D, James R. said, very unreliable Bluetooth connection to iOS devices. Rusty G. said, battery life. AHRS is kind of a joke. No way I would remotely rely on it, even in an emergency. Alan B. says, Bluetooth out to Garmin Pilot iOS app needs reset once a flight on average. Also works only with Garmin Pilot and ForeFlight. And there's some person says it's a little pricey. Now let's move on to the UAvionics Scout, which was just introduced a few months ago. When asked what people like most about this ADSB receiver, someone said size, another person said size, and Paul S. said small size. And those were all of the positive comments about it. When asked what you like least about the ADSB receiver, the Scout, Paul S. said needs separate power supply, and someone else said no battery, no AHRS. All right, so I guess no surprise that it doesn't include a battery or an AHRS because it's pretty inexpensive, about $200 as I recall. And regarding the Raspberry Pi and an SDR radio, which would be a home-built solution, the only comment was satisfied. And let's move on now to the dual XGPS 170 or 190. The positive comment was weather and METARs, and the negative comment was receiving traffic is spotty at best. I can't even and don't even bother using the receiver for traffic. Well, there you have it, our listener responses to the ADSB Portable Receiver Survey. Coming up, we've got listener feedback and questions. One listener asked, I hear pilots calling out things like airspeed alive, gear up, and other verbal callouts. What are your thoughts on this? We'll be right back. Welcome back. And before we get to our listener feedback and listener questions, a great big thank you because we got our very first review for the Aviation News Talk app that our Patreon sponsors helped fund and which we have released about a month ago. And if you are on the Apple platform, either the iPhone or the iPad, it's an easy way to get the show. You just go into the App Store and you search for Aviation News Talk, and then you can find our app. And this is an awesome way for folks who are not into podcast and just are not familiar with them to find the show. So if you have friends who are not particularly tech-oriented, don't know what a podcast is, steal their phone from them, go to the Apple App Store and go ahead and search for Aviation News Talk and then download the app for our show, which is dedicated to just this show, onto their phone. So big thanks to Aviation. He wrote great interface, great content in the title. He says, I've been listening to the podcast since episode 1 and they are a staple for my daily commute. This app has a great interface and makes listening to the podcast podcast easy. Specifically, the large play button with the ability to scroll through an episode around the play button makes it easy to go back and find bits of wisdom from past episodes. Keep it up, Max, and that's Clay from Claviation. So if you haven't tried out the app, please go out to the App Store, give it a try, and then if you would, please leave us a review so that other people will start finding the app. Let's move on to listener feedback. From Louisville, Kentucky, Shane writes, I am a CFI. I was listening to your podcast the other day, and a listener asked where he could find a recurrent training syllabus or a course that he could use for recurrent training. If you go to Conducting an Effective Flight Review, which is an FAA document, he says, go into Appendix 8, and there is what they call the Personal Proficiency Practice Plan, which he says might be helpful. Then he says, love the show. Shane, thanks so much for mentioning that. It's kind of ironic because I was actually one of the contributors to that document. You'll find my name listed in the credits of that FAA document, and I had totally forgotten that indeed there is a recurrent training syllabus in the back there. So I'll send a note to the person who asked that particular question a few episodes ago. And Jason from Belleville in Canada writes, I really enjoy your podcast. I've been a military pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force for the past 25 years. I received my private when I was 17 years old, but only recently returned to general aviation. Well, welcome. He says, I never knew how much I actually missed it. Yeah, it is fun. In one of your podcasts, you mentioned special VFR. He says, Transport Canada did a great article in their aviation safety letter in March 2012, and I thought I would share it with you. And he's got a link to that, and I'll go ahead and post that on our Patreon page, and there'll be a link in the show notes as well. Now let's move on to listener questions.
Hi, Max. My name is Brady, and I'm a student pilot in Mississippi. I have a question about learning priorities. Other than the most important stick and rudder skills that come with flight instruction, what are the most important skills to concentrate on as I progress through my training? Thank you so much for your podcast. I've been an avid listener ever since your first episode.
Brady, great question, because yes, indeed, your flight instructor will certainly teach you all the stick and rudder skills needed to pass your check ride, but there are so many other things which are needed to make sure that you are safe. So the first thing would be, do you have a knowledgeable CFI that you feel good about and that you trust and that you think will keep both of you safe when you're flying together, and who will educate you so that you'll be safe when you're out there flying on your own? For example, does your CFI emphasize safety, and do you see him or her as a pilot role model that you want to emulate as a pilot? Or does CFI have perhaps a personality that really grates on you, or you see or hear them talking about doing things that sound risky to you? In that case, you might want to think about trying to either find another CFI, or if you can't, just try and filter what they're telling you and just adopt their safe practices and not those things that seem a little bit risky to you. That relationship between you and the CFI is all important. You want to be able to trust the person. Second, I would learn about all the things that could kill a pilot. Learn about all the systems in your plane, how they work, how they can fail, and what you should do when they fail. And you can learn about that by reading your POH in detail, but also read one or more of the industry magazines like AOPA Pilot, EAA Sport Aviation, or Flying Magazine, or Plane and Pilot. So plan to educate yourself in all kinds of different ways, including sources like FAAsafety.gov, which has a lot of free online courses, and it will also allow you to sign up for seminars in your area. Just go ahead and specify your zip code and a distance you're willing to drive, and then try attending some of those wing seminars. Next, read everything you can about accidents. Learn how pilots are killing themselves, because sadly, they're not inventing new ways to do it. So if you learn about all the old ways, that's going to help keep you safe. There are lots of sources for this. I would encourage you to read NTSB reports, and I'll go ahead and put a link up on the Patreon page to the NTSB database where you can go ahead and search for those reports. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and you will find it. Now, 80 to 85% of all accidents are related to poor pilot judgment or lack of knowledge or skill. So what you really want to do is figure out where pilots have exercised poor judgment, what knowledge they may have lacked, or what skills they executed poorly. And then finally, go ahead and develop your own approach to risk management. Go ahead and read everything you can find out about it and come up with your own process that you want to use for evaluating the safety both before a flight and during a flight. One place to start would be the FAA's Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, which you can find at FAA.gov. And it turns out that Chapter 2 is called Aeronautical Decision Making, of which risk management is just one part of that chapter. So I think those things will help keep you safe. If you have good stick and rudder skills, I think you're going to have a long, happy flying career. And here's a question from Derek in Missouri. Derek is one of our Patreon sponsors. Thanks so much for that support, Derek. He says, the podcast just keeps getting better. I have a question. Watching and listening to a lot of audio and videos of flying, I hear the pilots briefing their departures, arrivals, landings, flight plans, etc. And I hear them calling out things like airspeed is alive, gear up, and doing verbal out loud checklist, etc. Then again, on some solo pilot videos, I don't see or hear them verbalizing such things. I'm thinking that a good safety practice is to verbalize all these, regardless of solo, dual, or whatever kinds of flight. What are your thoughts? Derek, I totally agree. I think that making these kinds of call-outs when you're flying by yourself is really excellent. Anytime you develop this as part of your routine, it's good practice. It helps you to focus on the critical steps at different points in the flight, and it really helps you develop a routine so that you'll do things the same way every time. Now, probably the most comprehensive use of callouts are those used by the airlines, though I don't think I have ever seen a list of them anywhere. So let's crowdsource an answer to this one. I'm going to ask the listeners right now, send me an email with links if you're aware of any lists of callouts that are posted online that pilots might be using throughout a flight, and especially if you have any links to callouts that are used by airline pilots. And Derek, I'll let you and other listeners know what we find out from that. Well, that's all the time we have for questions this week. If you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future show, please go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Listener Question and record your question, which I'll play on the show. Or if you want to send an email, go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. I'd love to hear from you about anything. And one more request, please go ahead and make a list of all your friends that might enjoy Aviation News Talk and share it with them. The app you're listening to probably has something on it you can click to directly share that episode with a friend by email. And don't forget, for your non-techie friends, tell them to look on their iPad or iPhone for the Aviation News Talk app in the App Store. And yes, I am still working on an app for Android phones. I'll let you know when that dedicated Aviation News Talk app is available. And if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now. I'll be happy to help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new Cirrus and help you understand all the many factors in buying a new versus a slightly used Cirrus. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. And for our U.S. listeners, please enjoy the rest of your Thanksgiving holiday weekend. And for everybody, until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. We have a new one this week. I want to thank Trevor Moody for signing on to become a sponsor. Speaking of the